Okay, so you've sent over this fascinating collection of materials, all centered around this, well, let's face it, often sensationalized idea of the Russian mafia.
It really is. It conjures up so many images, doesn't it?
Right.
Especially, in Western movies and media.
Exactly. But our mission today, using these sources you've shared, this overview document and the specific stuff on the Solntsevskaya Bratva, is to, well, dig a bit deeper than that.
Precisely. We want to unpack what that term really means.
Yeah.
Look at the history, how these groups actually talk about themselves, how they're structured, and just how far their influence goes. Globally, I mean.
Yeah, get past the stereotypes and into the nuances.
That's the plan. It's complex.
Okay, so let's start right there with the name itself, Russian Mafia. It's the label everyone knows, but the sources suggest it's maybe too broad?
It absolutely is, especially from an internal or, say, a Russian law enforcement perspective. It's a Western catch-all, mostly.
Right, so what terms are used? I saw Bratva mentioned a lot.
Yeah, Bratva, it literally translates to brotherhood. It's pretty colloquial, sort of like how group members might refer to themselves or their crew, like the guys or the brotherhood.
So not a formal rank or anything?
No, not at all. It doesn't describe a position in a hierarchy. It's more of an informal identifier for the group itself.
Okay, what about Vori Visa Cone? That sounds much more specific, more formal somehow.
Ah, yes, Vori B. Zakon. That translates as thieves-in-law. Now, that is a very specific and, historically at least, incredibly prestigious title.
Prestigious? How so?
Well, these are, or were, considered the absolute elite of the traditional criminal world. They adhered to a really strict, almost moral code.
The criminal moral code.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah?
A core tenet was absolute rejection of the state and any cooperation with authorities. No working, no collaborating in prison, nothing.
Wow, and they had ways of identifying each other. I read something about tattoos.
That's right. Elaborate, symbolic tattoos were crucial. They basically acted as a visual resume, you know, showing their criminal history, their rank, their commitment to the code. These VORs, they often acted as mediators, judges almost, within the broader criminal community.
Like a governing council for the underworld? Fascinating. So how does actual law enforcement refer to them? Less romantically, I assume.
Much less romantically, yes. They use bureaucratic terms, acronyms mainly. You'll see OPG, Organizovanaya Prestupnaya Grupa, or Organized Crime Group.
OPG, got it.
And sometimes OPS, Organizovanaya Prestupnoye Subchestvo, which is more like organized crime community, suggesting a larger network. Formal, dry language.
And many of these groups, these OPGs, seem to be named after places like Solntsevskaya, Tambovskaya.
Exactly. That's very common. It
Yeah.
points to their origins. The Solntsevskaya Bratva started in the Solntsevskaya district of Moscow, the Tambovskaya from Tambov Oblast.
So tied to a specific territory initially.
Initially, yes. It might indicate their home base or where they first gained power, but as we'll see, their operations often spread far, far beyond those geographical origins.
Okay, here's something a bit confusing from the sources, though. There's this contrast. In 2009, a Russian Interpol official apparently said there wasn't much data showing organized structures of former Russians abroad.
Right.
But then, just a year later, a French criminologist is quoted calling them one of the best structured groups in Europe. How does that work? Those seem contradictory.
It does seem contradictory on the surface, yeah. But it might highlight different perspectives or definitions of structure. The Interpol officials might have been looking for, rigid hierarchical structures directly commanded from Russia, the kind that specific intelligence intercepts could prove.
Like a clear chain of command back to Moscow.
Exactly. Whereas the French criminologist might have been observing the effects, the operational effectiveness, the coordination, the impact of what could be more fluid, network-based structures operating internationally.
Ah, so less like a traditional pyramid, maybe more like interconnected hubs.
Precisely. These networks might not have a single godfather figure pulling all the strings from one place, but they can still be incredibly organized and effective in their activities. It just underlines that this isn't one single entity, the Russian Mafia. It's diverse.
Okay, that makes more sense. Let's shift gears then and look at the history. The sources suggest these roots go way, way back, long before the Soviet Union even.
Oh, absolutely. You can trace forms of organized banditry back centuries in Russia. In the 17th, 18th centuries, you had large peasant gangs, often driven by social unrest.
More like rebels almost.
Sometimes with a political edge, yeah. And later, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you had revolutionary groups, counter-revolutionary groups, all using criminal methods. The one constant: the state always came down hard on them. Brutal suppression was the norm.
So how did the Soviet era change things? You'd think total state control would stamp it out.
You would think so. But the Soviet system, ironically, created its own unique conditions for organized crime. When the state cracked down hard on private enterprise, especially after the NEP period, well, it pushed everything underground.
Making criminals out of entrepreneurs?
In a way, yes. But it also fostered a new kind of criminal identity, one unified not by politics, but by opposition to the all-powerful state itself. This is where the vori v zakone, the thieves in law, really solidified their identity.
As guardians of an older tradition.
Exactly. They saw themselves as preserving pre-revolutionary criminal traditions, standing completely apart from the Soviet system and its norms.
And this is where that subculture developed. The language, the codes.
Absolutely. A whole distinct world within a world. They had their own slang, fenya, which made communication obscure to outsiders. And the code, the pointed head, was incredibly detailed. For the Vors, it meant rejecting normal life, sometimes even family ties, and absolutely no cooperation with the state, ever.
But I remember reading about a major conflict, something called the Bitch Wars. That sounds like it fractured things.
It did, massively. That happened in the prison camps, the gulags, during and after World War II. Huge numbers of criminals were drafted into the army to fight the Nazis.
Okay.
When those soldiers returned to the camps after the war, they clashed violently with the traditionalist Vors who hadn't fought, who had stuck rigidly to the no cooperation rule. The veterans were labeled Suki bitches for having served the state.
So, a war between traditionalists and those who'd compromised.
Essentially, yes. It was incredibly bloody and fundamentally weakened the authority and unity of the old Vor code. The criminal world became much more fragmented after that.
Then, later in the Soviet period, the 50s and 60s, the sources mention economic factors. Blat and eyewash.
Right. The planned economy was notoriously inefficient. To get anything done, to meet quotas, you needed connections blat. And to cover up failures, you needed deception, apokazuku, or eyewash.
So, informal networks became essential.
Absolutely essential. And this created a need for middlemen, fixers, people who could operate outside the official system to get scarce goods or materials.
Yeah.
This led to a rise in things like petty theft, speculation, black marketeering.
And this paved the way for more organized groups, the Sekoviki.
Exactly. Around the mid-1960s, you see the emergence of the Sekoviki. These are underground factory operators, essentially shadow economy entrepreneurs making goods illegally or semi-legally.
Okay.
And traditional criminals saw an opportunity. They started forming relationships with these Sekoviki, offering protection rackets, helping distribute goods, taking a cut. It was a symbiotic relationship, the beginnings of modern organized crime structures.
And this wasn't just small-time stuff. It reached higher up.
Oh, definitely. They developed this often hidden connection between parts of the political elite, the nomenclatura, and the criminal world.
How so?
Officials might use criminal networks to get access to goods or services unavailable through legal channels, Western luxuries, building materials, whatever. In return, they'd offer protection, turning a blind eye.
So corruption was lubricating the system.
In many ways, yes.
Mm.
Andropov's anti-corruption drive in the early 80s, short-lived as it was, gave a glimpse of how intertwined things had become, but it was probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Then came Gorbachev. The sources highlight his anti-alcohol campaign as a major accelerator.
Huge. Absolutely huge. Intended to fight alcoholism, it basically created an enormous, incredibly profitable black market for booze overnight. This enriched a whole new ways of underground entrepreneurs.
Unintended consequences.
Massively unintended. And then perestroika, the broader reforms. While aiming to restructure the economy and politics, it kind of loosened the state's grip just enough for things to spiral.
How did that play out for crime?
Well, it created pathways to legalize illicit money. Criminal groups started using the media, which was becoming freer, for protection or influence. Law enforcement became less effective during the upheaval, and crucially, borders started opening up.
Leading to more international activity.
Exactly. Illegal trade, exporting capital out of the country, corruption involving foreign entities. It all exploded in the late 80s and early 90s.
And this is when racketeering really took off.
Racketeering, the Krisha or roof system, became absolutely central. But they also moved heavily into controlling chunks of the legal and illegal economy, hotels, gambling, exporting raw materials like timber and metals. Huge money involved.
It sounds like a convergence of factors: shadow money, weak state, new opportunities.
Precisely. You had existing criminal capital looking for legitimacy. You had the chaos of privatization where state assets were sold off cheap. And according to some sources, even foreign intelligence agencies trying to gain influence through these burgeoning criminal business networks.
And this led to the rise of the oligarchs, where lines blurred completely.
That's the narrative, yes. By the mid to late 90s, reports were suggesting that criminal groups controlled staggering percentages of private businesses, state enterprises, even banks. Legitimate capital and criminal capital became almost indistinguishable in many cases. The oligarchic model, immense wealth, combined with political influence, often with very shady origins.
Okay, let's track that expansion globally. The 90s weren't just about consolidating power within Russia, were they?
Not at all. Alongside the racketeering and moving into legitimate business, they massively expanded into international drug trafficking, arms dealing, human trafficking, complex money laundering schemes, you name it.
And they were investing this money too.
Oh, yes, heavily.
Yeah.
Into banks, real estate, resource extraction companies, both inside Russia and abroad. Some groups became incredibly powerful, basically controlling entire sectors in certain regions.
Like the examples given Tambovskaya in St. Petersburg's energy, Solntsevskaya in Moscow's casinos.
Exactly. And these groups were known for, well, extreme violence when necessary, but also for their sophistication in infiltrating politics and law enforcement. Key figures emerged, people like Semyon Mogilevich, Yaroslav Ivankov, building these powerful networks.
And this expansion went far beyond the old Soviet borders.
Way beyond. Western Europe became a major playground, the UK, Spain, Germany, France, Italy. Also places like Hungary, Israel, the Czech Republic. They often set up shop by linking with local criminals or using emigre communities and front companies.
The sources mention Vyacheslav Ivankov Yaponchik being specifically sent to Brighton Beach, New York. That sounds like a deliberate strategy.
It really does. The story goes he was dispatched there around 1992, maybe partly because he was becoming too powerful or troublesome back in Russia, but primarily to take control of the somewhat disorganized Russian criminal scene in North America.
And was he successful?
Apparently, quite. He built up a significant operation extortion, fraud, rumored links to narcotics, money laundering. He reportedly even brokered ties with traditional American mafia families and Colombian cartels. His arrival also apparently stopped some bloody infighting between other Russian figures there.
But his reign didn't last forever.
No, the FBI caught up with him. He was arrested in 1995 for extortion. Big case at the time.
And Mogilevich. His name keeps popping up. Connections to Italian groups. Billions in net worth.
Mogilevich is often described as one of the most powerful, perhaps the most powerful figure. The alleged links to the Italian Camorra suggest serious transnational cooperation. And yes, estimates of his wealth run into the billions, which gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about.
There was another figure mentioned, Ludwig Feinberg, Tarzan. His arrest also showed the global reach.
Right, Feinberg's case in 1997 was wild. It involved plots to buy a Soviet submarine for Colombian drug cartels, allegedly. It really highlighted the extent of the arms dealing and narcotics connections. And they were using places as far-flung as Vanuatu for money laundering. Global indeed.
Moving into the 2000s, it seems like a mixed bag. Some bosses getting out of prison, others getting arrested, and Ivankov's story had a grim ending.
Yeah, the dynamics kept shifting. Ivankov was eventually deported back to Russia after his U.S. sentence, got arrested again there, was acquitted, and then assassinated in Moscow in 2009. A very violent end.
And law enforcement pressure continued. FBI in Moscow, Mogilevich on the most wanted list.
Yes, 2009 was a busy year. The FBI set up a legal attaché office in Moscow and was actively targeting figures linked to U.S. operations. And Mogilevich being put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for a massive investment fraud scheme really raised his international profile, not in a good way for him.
Then came those WikiLeaks cables in 2010 calling Russia a mafia state. That must have caused a stir.
Huge stir. Along with earlier claims, like those by the poisoned dissident Alexander Litvinenko, alleging a long-standing good relationship between Mogilevich and Vladimir Putin. Well, it fueled intense speculation about the lines between organized crime and the state itself.
Are those lines still blurred?
That's the million-dollar or maybe billion-dollar question, isn't it? The sources certainly suggest ongoing ambiguity and potential connections.
And the activity definitely hasn't stopped. Those 2017 arrests you mentioned in the U.S. and Spain, even involving stolen chocolate.
Huh. Yeah, the chocolate theft was part of the indictment against the Shalaya clan, an alleged Russian Mafia group busted by the FBI in places like Atlantic City and Philadelphia. They were into all sorts of extortion, illegal gambling, credit card fraud, and apparently truckloads of chocolate.
Bizarre, but the Spanish operations sounded more focused on finance.
Very much so. Major operations targeting alleged money laundering by groups like the Solntsevskaya and Izmailovskaya, particularly through Spanish real estate. Big arrests, asset seizures, and a major trial involving high-profile figures. The name Alexander Torshin, a former Russian politician, also came up in reports related to Spanish investigations, alleging links to the Tiganskaya OPG.
Okay, let's try to pin down the structure a bit more. We said it's not strictly hierarchical, more decentralized.
That's the key takeaway. It's often described as a network of networks, rather than a single pyramid. Power comes from influence, connections, reputation, control over resources, not just a title on an org chart. This makes it flexible, adaptable.
But there are recognized roles within these networks, like the Pakan.
Yes, certain roles tend to exist. The Pakan is generally understood to be the top boss, the leader, though they might operate very much in the shadows. Their authority is paramount within their specific group or network.
And the Opshak. That sounds important.
Critically important. The Obshak is the communal fund, the treasury. It's money pooled from various criminal activities.
What's it used for?
All sorts of things. Funding new operations, bribing officials, covering legal fees for members, supporting the families of those in prison. It's the financial lifeblood and a key source of collective power and security.
And below the Pakan, how are things organized on the ground?
Often into smaller operational units, sometimes called brigades. These are led by an F-Tortet, literally, an authority figure. They run the day-to-day activities of their crew.
Managers, basically.
Sort of, yeah. Below them, you have the Boviki, the soldiers, the muscle, the enforcers who carry out violent tasks.
And at the bottom.
You've got the Shestyorki, which translates roughly as sixes. These are the junior guys, the gophers, runners, apprentices, basically, doing lower-level tasks, proving their loyalty, hoping to rise through the ranks.
And where did the Vori v. Zakoni fit into this modern picture? Is that title still relevant?
It is, though perhaps its nature has evolved. It still carries immense prestige and signifies a certain level of, well, moral and strategic authority within the criminal world. It's not just about brute force, it's about upholding traditions, resolving disputes.
And it's still something you have to be granted.
Oh yes. You can't just declare yourself a Vor, you have to be crowned by other existing Vors, based on your reputation and adherence to the code, or at least the modern interpretation of it. Loyalty and silence omerta remain absolutely crucial, especially at the higher levels.
Okay, let's zoom in on the Solntsevskaya Bratva then. They feature prominently in the sources. How did they start?
They emerged in the late 1980s, right during that chaotic perestroika period. Founded by Sergei Mikhailov, often known as Mikas, in the Solntsevo district of Moscow.
And how did they rise so fast?
They were smart. They recruited heavily among local unemployed youth, especially guys with athletic backgrounds. Crucially, they allied themselves early on with a respected thief in law, Jamal Khachidze, which gave them instant credibility in the underworld.
Location mattered too, didn't it?
Absolutely. Solntsevo was strategically located near major transport routes, including the highway to the west and Vnukovo Airport. This gave them a huge advantage in the booming, often illegal, car import business that was taking off then.
And they weren't shy about conflict, mentioned alliances against Chechen groups.
No, they were very aggressive. They formed alliances, notably with the Orokhovskaya gang, another powerful Slavic group, specifically to challenge and push back against Chechen Mafia groups, who were also trying to dominate Moscow's criminal scene in the early 90s. It was often violent.
And they capitalized on the post-Soviet chaos.
Big time. They built political connections, moved heavily into laundering money by investing in legitimate businesses, banks, casinos, hotels. They even gained influence or control over parts of Vnukovo Airport itself. That link to Semyon Mogilevich was also reportedly established during this period.
We talked about that Prague summit in 1995 that got raided. Solntsevskaya members were there.
They were. It was reportedly Mikhailov's birthday party, but law enforcement suspected it was a major meeting of bosses. The raid happened because of rumors Mogilevich might be assassinated there. Lots of high-profile figures detained, though charges didn't stick. Mogilevich himself, notably, wasn't present.
And later they moved more into banking.
Yes, towards the late 90s, like many major groups, they saw the strategic importance of the banking sector for money laundering and integrating their capital.
And they expanded internationally too, sending people out.
Definitely. We mentioned Ivankov going to the U.S., though his primary affiliation might be debated. But sources also mention Solntsevskaya sending figures like Mikhail Odanusa to Atlanta, Georgia. Reports suggest Odanusa has allegedly controlled significant Russian organized crime activities there for years.
And Israel was mentioned as well.
Yes, primarily as a center for money laundering operations, taking advantage of immigration laws and the financial system there.
There was even a mention of a subdivision in New York State. Doctors Bratva.
Yeah, that name pops up in some reports, suggesting an affiliated cell operating in upstate New York. Details are often murky, but it points to that networked expansion.
And those WikiLeaks cables suggested ongoing activity, possibly under state protection.
That was the allegation in some cables, yes, that they continued racketeering activities, potentially with some level of protection or tolerance from elements within the FSB, the Russian Security Service. Again, hard to verify definitively, but it fits the pattern of blurred lines.
And the recent Spanish arrests confirmed their continued international presence.
Absolutely. Those large-scale money laundering busts directly implicated individuals allegedly linked to Solntsevskaya, showing their operations are still very much active across Europe.
Wow. Okay, this has been incredibly illuminating. We've gone from the broad, almost mythical term Russian Mafia to something much more, well, real and complicated.
It really is a world away from the simple stereotypes, isn't it? You see the deep historical roots, the evolution from banditry to sophisticated transnational crime, the complex and shifting relationship with the state.
Yeah, and understanding the language, Bratva, VOR, OPG, and the decentralized network structure seems absolutely vital to actually grasping what these groups are and how they operate.
Exactly. It moves us beyond just movie villains into understanding a significant global phenomenon with real-world impact.
So thinking about everything we discussed, the history, the adaptability, the global reach, the technological advances happening now, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How will these networks continue to adapt and evolve?
That's the critical question. With things like cryptocurrencies, cybercrime, shifting geopolitical alliances, their methods and structures are bound to keep changing.
And what does that mean for international security, for global economies? If they've proven so resilient and adaptable for so long, what comes next? Definitely something for all of us to think about.